We are zeroing in today on school choice and the virtues of providing parents with the opportunity to choose the best educational institution for their children. Or maybe it's a homeschool opportunity and they'd rather do it themselves. That's what school choice is about, is making sure that parents have the greatest opportunity, the greatest choice for themselves and their children. Let's dive in to this very topic today with two leading scholars on the issue of educational freedom and school choice. Lindsey Burke is the director of the Center for Education Policy and Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. And Corey DeAngelis is director of the School Choice at the Reason Foundation. In addition, Lindsey is a fellow at EdChoice, which was an organization founded by the Friedmans. And also, Corey DeAngelis is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Welcome to the show to you both. Thanks so much for joining us, and happy Free to Choose Friday.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to play a clip of the great late Milton Friedman responding to a criticism. This is back in 1980 from his Free to Choose series in Cut 5. This is Milton Friedman responding to some of the criticisms leveled against school choice from a liberal that was on that very program.
The finest schools that you saw in that film were schools that deliberately kept out the most difficult students. Of course you can have a wonderful school if you pick students who are whose parents whose parents are so highly motivated that they're willing to spend more money and willing to go out of their way to do something like that. Now, the public schools have to take the handicap, must provide bilingual education, must engage in busing or other programs in terms of integration, must do all of these things, whereas the private school can come along and say, well, if your child has no problems, you know what we can do? We can offer you a school where you don't have to sit next to a child with these other problems. We're going to put you next to other children who are advantaged.
I think in the real world there is no competition between private schools and public schools, because private schools, especially parochial schools, do not have to comply with federal and state mandates and constitutional limitations and things of that sort.
Dr. Andrig.
I think the role of public education in a democracy is not akin to that of the marketplace. The purpose for the common school is not the same as the purpose for the marketplace. We are trying in our public schools to create a democracy, to create an educated electorate. If you're going to do that, you have to have the common school.
Okay, I forgot that actually I wanted to have these liberals in 1980 to whom Milton Friedman responded, shown on the screen so that you could both respond to them. Lindsey Burke, you first. Go ahead.
Well,
what are your thoughts?
I mean, I will never respond as whatever Milton Friedman himself had responded as well as he would have responded, but I will give it a shot.
None of us could.
To invoke, what Friedman said, right? And when he wrote his original 1955 essay on the role of government in education, this was where he first really articulated the idea of school choice, of vouchers specifically. And he said, separate the financing of education from the delivery of services, that public education does not require government administration of schooling. And he made that point really forcefully, but it did remain an academic idea for a long time. But now we have seen over the past few decades it work in practice, and everything that you just heard from those folks, the progressives, I guess, at the time in that 1980 film, is completely inaccurate. And I would say the number one reason that is inaccurate is because families are selecting into these options. No one is forcing a family to attend a private school that they do not want to attend. The same cannot be said for our government assignment model of schooling, where we relegate a child to a government-run school based on where their family can afford to buy a home, regardless of whether or not that school is the right fit. And so Friedman would have said, we're breaking housing apart from schooling, and we're actually putting power back in the hands of families to determine for themselves and for their child if a given private school is the right fit, and giving them the financial tools by simply allowing dollars to follow them to pay for that private school tuition. And I'll let Corey weigh in as well. But this idea, one of the gentlemen in that clip said, well, public schools try to infuse democracy and civic values. Well, the operative word there is try, because we know from all of the empirical data that public schools too often are failing on so many important metrics like reading achievement, right? Only a third of students across the country can read proficiently. Fewer than that can do civics and mathematics proficiently. Only 1/3 of Americans across the country today can name a single branch of government. So the onus should be on the government system to say why they should remain entitled to families' dollars rather than giving families a choice to select into other options.
Corey DeAngelis, please do add on to what Lindsey said, but also when we look at what these gentlemen were saying in the video from 1980, 40 years ago, the arguments were very similar to a lot of the counter-arguments we see to educational choice in the year 2020.
Yeah, educational choice opponents often compare private schooling and school choice to perfection, something that we don't have, which Lindsey very correctly pointed out. The nation's latest report card came out just a couple of weeks ago in civics and geography and U.S. history. Only 15% of kids in the U.S. were proficient in U.S. history, and 3 out of every 4 children were not proficient in civics or geography either. So we don't have this well-educated, democratic populace that they're imagining that we have. But then also school choice benefits the least advantaged more than anyone else. Rich people already have school choice. Rich people can afford to live near the best public schools, and they can already afford to pay out of pocket for private schools. So school choice programs in the form of a voucher and education savings account disproportionately benefits the least advantaged more than anyone else because their kids are stuck in the worst government schools right now, and they're the least likely to be able to afford to pay for private school tuition out of pocket. So in that sense, school choice is an equalizer. And in practice, if you look at these programs, overwhelmingly, they're targeted to the least advantaged based on lower income families, students with special needs, and then students who are in lower performing government run schools. So school choice is an equalizer, and anyone trying to claim the opposite is just not looking at the evidence and not contending with the fact that rich people already have school choice.
Lindsey Burke, one thing that strikes me too about those who oppose the idea of providing parents with greater choice for how to best educate their children, one thing that's striking is that they always presume that you automatically oppose public schools, that say you want to defund public schools in order to provide that kind of experience. I'm a big advocate, especially because I don't see government schools going away, a big advocate of providing a good quality public school education as an option for parents to provide for their students, but also making sure that we pay teachers more. We see administrative costs across the country that have just become absolutely bloated as teacher pay has not even just not risen, but in some cases has even gone down in parts of the country, while administration is getting more and more funding headed in its direction. So talk to us a little bit about this idea, this myth that supporting educational choice means that you oppose public schools and basically want to disenfranchise those who are going to public schools.
Right. So this all comes back to what Friedman originally articulated, which was fund the student and then allow those dollars to flow wherever the family chooses. And so we have to redefine how we think about public education. Public education should be an education available to the public, but we can separate that from this idea of government delivery. So yes, as Friedman said, publicly fund the child, but allow those dollars to follow to any school, public, private, charter, whatever it might be. This administrative bloat point is incredibly important. This is something, there is a lot of data now on administrative bloat. If you go all the way back to 1950, prior to the Great Society, Johnson's Great Society, when we saw massive government intervention in education, there were about 2.36 teachers for every non-teacher in a school district across the country. Fast forward to today, that number is 1 to 1. So that means, on average, in a district, for every teacher you see walking around, there is a non-teaching administrative counterpart. And that's been a huge strain on state budgets. I'll just say quickly, why have we seen what some would argue is maybe mismanagement or at least not good prioritization of spending in districts? It's because they don't have to worry as much about that prioritization. When Friedman wrote that Role of Government in Education essay, he outlined that there are basically 4 ways that you can spend money. And I love this example because I think it works really well for school choice. So Friedman said, you can spend your own money on yourself, you can spend your own money on somebody else, you can spend somebody else's money on yourself, or you can spend somebody else's money on somebody else. That last category is how public schools spend money. It's just how they're designed. They spend somebody else's money, your taxpayer dollars, on somebody else's children. And so there's very little, if any, incentive to economize or to maximize value. School choice options get us much, much closer to spending your own money on your own children. And so that is why not only do they maximize educational opportunity and outcomes, but they help with that dollar allocation as well.
Again, Lindsey Burke is director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and Corey DeAngelis is director of the School Choice at the Reason Foundation. And Corey, I want to go with you to one particular criticism that I hear about school choice, and that is the idea that you hold different schools from a government standpoint to different standards. So there are particular standards that public schools must meet in order to get certain funding, access to this and that, so they have standardized testing and so forth. But private schools and homeschooling, those things can be treated differently in certain ways. You also have different licensing requirements for teachers at private schools, even charter schools, than traditional public schools. And so some say you shouldn't give funding from the government, from taxpayers, to those kinds of schools because those teachers and those educational institutions are treated differently. To which you say what to that criticism?
You shouldn't give funding to any schools at all. The funding should go to the individual. No, the funding should go to the person, and the person should be able to choose those government schools if the regulations are actually beneficial, and if standardized testing requirements are actually beneficial, then families will continue to choose those government-run schools. My argument is that while those top-down regulations aren't all that beneficial, maybe we should get rid of some of those regulations that are hampering down the government-run schools and instead hold schools accountable from the bottom up like we do in every other industry by allowing people to vote with their feet. And I also want to add, based on the previous point, that, look, school choice is good for teachers too, because it gives individual private, public schools stronger incentives to allocate the money towards the students in the classroom and to raise teacher salaries. If you look at Ben Scafferty's latest report on this, he found that between 1992 and 2014, real inflation-adjusted per pupil spending in the U.S. has gone up by 27%. Real teacher salaries have actually dropped by 2% in the U.S. Where's all the money going? It's not going to the classroom. And that, I argue, is because the public schools do not have strong incentives to spend the money wisely.